Now let's look at some problems with fractions. When we're dealing with fractions, the rules are still the same. We are going to start with step 1, which tells us to simplify each side of the equal sign or inequality if we're doing an inequality. In this first problem, we have two variable terms. We want to combine like terms. The coefficients need to be added together. In order to do that, we need to have common denominators. So I'm going to take the 5 and turn it into an improper fraction with a common denominator of 7 so that I can add those two fractions together. Now that they have common denominators, I can successfully add my coefficients, simplifying the right side of my equation. Now that both sides of the equations have been simplified, I can move on to the next step, which actually is step 3 because I don't have anything to add or subtract to either side. So step 3 is to isolate our variable, which we will do by multiplying or dividing. In this case, we have a coefficient being multiplied to our variable, so we can divide both sides by our coefficient. Now keep in mind, when dividing fractions, we actually divide fractions by multiplying by the reciprocal. So we flip the fraction and multiply in order to divide by a fraction. And so we can think about this as a division problem, or we can actually think about this as a multiplication problem. So we can actually think about this as multiplying both sides by the reciprocal. Because in the end, really, in order to do this division, we're actually going to have to do this multiplication set here. And so when I do that multiplication, it will cancel out my fraction on the right side. And when I multiply this side, I'm actually going to get 35. And I can do that step, kind of finding common denominators and working through those fractions using the rules of fractions I already know to solve all of the inequalities and the equations based on everything we already know. But I do want to let you know that in some cases, it can get pretty complicated having all of those fractions floating around. And so you might want to consider eliminating the fraction altogether from the beginning. And so when you have fractions that have variables at the in the fraction itself, like in the numerator, maybe there's a distributive property happening inside the fraction with the variable, it can get pretty complicated. And so maybe we want to start by eliminating our fraction altogether, eliminating the denominator, and then working through the equation. And so that's what these steps are here to help us do. Step 1, we will identify the LCD. Then in step 2, we will multiply each side by the LCD. This is an important step because that is the step that allows us to eliminate our denominators. Do keep in mind that if you're working with an inequality, when you multiply by a negative number, you have to reverse the signs. But our LCDs should be positive and not negative. But if for some reason you end up multiplying by a negative number in this step, you want to make sure you keep that in mind. And then step 3, when I'm done with these two first steps, step 3 should leave me with an equation or inequality with no fractions. And so I can continue doing the steps from previous of just solving the equation or inequality. So let's look at that here. We'll start by finding our LCD. If I count by 2s and then count by 5s, we'll see that 10 is the first number they have in common. So my LCD is 10, which means I am going to multiply everything in our fraction by 10. Or not a fraction, but our equation. We're going to multiply everything in our equation by 10. We'll multiply the 2r fifths. We'll multiply the 19 as well as the negative 3 halves r. 10 times 2 is 20, and 20 divided by 5 is 4. 10 times 19 is 190. 10 times 3 is 30, and 30 divided by 2 is 15. And now we have a equation without a fraction. So we can go ahead and go back to our other steps from the previous videos and solve this equation. So I'll start with making sure that my variable terms and my constant terms are on different sides. We do have a constant term on this side, so I want to go ahead and move that variable term to the side where the other variable term is. So we're going to move the 4r and now we want to isolate our variable by dividing by our coefficient. And that will leave us with r equaling 10. Now, if we're looking at an inequality is done the same way. The only difference is we're looking at inequality, and we want to make sure that if we're doing any division or multiplication with negative numbers, that we keep that rule of flipping that sign there in mind. So our LCD here, there's only one fraction, so our LCD is going to be 4. My pen isn't wanting to write for me. So I'm going to multiply everything by 4. So multiply x over 4 by 4. Multiply the 28 by 4. And multiply the 2x by 4. So everything gets multiplied by 4. 4 times 4, not 4 times 4, 4 divided by 4 is 1. And 4 times 24, 4 times 28 is 112. And 4 times 2 is 8x. And now we can do the other steps, which are going to get us to move our variable term to the other side. And then isolate our variable, which is this 7 here, by dividing by that 7. And we can leave our answer like this, or if you prefer to have your variable on the left side, you can rewrite your answer with the variable on the left side. Keep in mind that if I move the variable to the left side, I do want to make sure I make adjustments to the inequality symbol because I want them to be equivalent. This says that 16 is greater than x, and this one says that 16 is less than, says that x is less than 16 or less than or equal to. So these are equivalent. So keep that in mind if you are going to rewrite it so that the x is on the left side.